Good afternoon and welcome back to the panel Feminist Foreign Policy in Times of War, From Policy to Action. What is feminist foreign policy? What concept stands behind this term? And what countries already implemented something like that? The speakers in this panel will be Serafine Dinkel, Associate Fellow in German Council on Foreign Relations, Elena Stavrevska, Lecturer in International Relations, University of Bristol, Karolina Leaković, International Secretary of Social Democratic Party of Croatia, and this panel will be moderated by Jelenka Kirchner, Associate Researcher on Institute for Democracy, Societas, Civilis. Ladies, please take the stage.
Thank you very much. Welcome. I'm very happy that today we can be here on this very timely topic, feminist foreign policy, with a panel of great experts. At this conference, we've spent the past couple of days picking our brains about how to do things differently in Europe, how to counter global threats and global chaos. And I don't think I'm spilling any secrets when I say that we have a tendency to go around in circles, talk about the same things, to not really come to any novel solutions. And I'm therefore very happy that we now have some time to be talking about feminist approaches, feminist foreign policy, and to really brave to think things a little differently. FFP is still very much in the process of being defined. There is no one definition, and I would like to dive right in with you, Serafine, to give us an introduction to what FFP is, what FFP can be, since you're German, maybe particularly in this German context, and to set the tone for this panel by letting us know, why should we care? Why would this matter?
Yeah, thank you, Marie. You already touched upon the fact that there's no single definition of feminist foreign policy, and that is because there is no single feminist approach, so there's always a multiplicity of feminisms. But perhaps just to anchor this debate a little bit, one of the definitions that was advanced by the think tank Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, that kind of was a partner for the German government as well in developing what is now its guidelines on feminist foreign policy, is that feminist foreign policy, or FFP, is a political framework centered around the well-being of marginalized people. It invokes processes of self-reflection regarding foreign policy's hierarchical global systems. It wants an alternate and intersectional rethinking of security from the viewpoint of the most vulnerable. It aims to elevate the experiences of women and marginalized groups and accord them agency to scrutinize the destructive forces of patriarchy, colonization, heteronormativity, capitalism, racism, imperialism, and militarism. So that is one of several definitions, but I think the main consensus that we can draw from this is that it's not just a foreign policy for women, but it is meant to be a foreign policy for everyone. So it has this inclusive justice dimension. And in the German vision that was formulated more or less throughout the last year, it is also seen as an inclusive, intersectional foreign policy that reflects the needs of society as a whole. So Marie, you mentioned the German context, so a little bit of context on that. I know it was also discussed already in the last panel on the Zeitenwende. So implementing a feminist foreign policy was one of the commitments of the German government during the last 2 years. And the process and the consultation that led to what has now been published in March as the guidelines on feminist foreign policy took place in this context of the Zeitenwende, and we can discuss later on maybe some of the tensions that this has brought about. And you asked why it matters, Marie, and in this context there was some skepticism on why do we need feminist foreign policy now? We need to think about our security, the security orders under attack. Those were kind of the arguments that the proponents were facing. But I really think it's kind of commonsensical to understand that in a situation of war, people are differently affected. And it is always the security of people that is under attack of individuals, and not just that of a state or even an organization or a quasi-state. At the end, it's about individuals, and these are disproportionately affected, and especially vulnerable and marginalized people are affected differently. And feminist foreign policy has the ambition to take into account these differences, and ultimately to try and remedy some of the injustices and serve everyone. So, for example, in a war situation where you are seeing attacks on hospitals, we know that the wounded and sick are a vulnerable group, or people with physical disabilities might find it harder to access shelters if there's aerial bombing, or they might have a harder time accessing basic care and fulfilling their daily needs because they have a restricted mobility. Then we have also seen in different contexts the strategic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war against civilians, the vast majority of whom are women. LGBTQI persons can face difficulties. For example, they're vulnerable now in parts of Russian-occupied territories in Ukraine. And another example that we saw last year was that people of color had a harder time leaving Ukraine and faced some discrimination also in their transit and arrival. So I think even if one is uncomfortable with the term feminist, one can understand what it's about and what the consequences of foreign and security policy are for different people. So perhaps very briefly, being conscious of the time, in Germany, the process was led as a consultation with experts and with civil society groups as well. And that led to the foreign policy guidelines published by the Foreign Office in March, along with some guidelines on feminist development policy. And these guidelines, they follow mainly the Swedish model. So Sweden adopted a feminist foreign policy in 2014, defining the 3 R's, so accounting for rights, resources, and representation in feminist foreign policy. And the German guidelines now add diversity to these 3 R's, so taking a more intersectional perspective. And also, what I find quite interesting is the idea of a feminist reflex that is to be implemented in foreign policy going forward. And I will be quiet for now and leave some room for the other speakers, but happy to discuss more.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, it was a difficult task to be like, okay, you have 5 minutes, explain everything about feminist foreign policy. And I think there's a lot of things in there where we can dig a little deeper in the coming hour that we have. For now, I would like to take a step back for a moment. You did mention the implications of war, of violence for specific groups in society. You mentioned inclusive and justice dimension of a feminist foreign policy, and that isn't something that is on the agenda only since 2014 when Sweden introduced feminist foreign policy. Most well-known and best institutionalized, I would say, has been the WPS agenda. And Elena, maybe you can shed a little bit more light on what this agenda means, where it came from, and how it relates to feminist foreign policy today. So,
right, yeah. Sure. In 5 minutes, no problem. No, but it's actually much easier to go after the outline of feminist foreign policy. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda, in many ways, one could consider the predecessor of the feminist foreign policy as a concept and also as a policy that has been at least declared, in some cases advanced, by different countries now. So the WPS, the first resolution, 1325, and some would actually call WPS 1325, which is doesn't do justice to the agenda, but I'll get to that in a second. So the first resolution was adopted in 2000. And it's especially poignant to talk about that in this context where we are, physical context, because it came in the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars and the way gender was weaponized, not only in that conflict, but it had historically has been weaponized in conflicts. So it was pushed forward by feminist activists. Of course, it lost some of the appeal by different countries, then bringing it to the UN Security Council, inevitably. But what is important about the Women, Peace and Security agenda is that essentially it is an agenda not about adding women and considering women in peace and conflict contexts, but it is about transformation of structures that create gendered experience or differently positioned people, including women, but not only women, become more vulnerable in certain situations. So the agenda itself, which by now constitutes of 10 resolutions that cover a range of topics, and then it also constitutes this little ecosystem, which is not so little anymore, where we have more than 100 countries worldwide who have adopted national action plans for the implementation of women, peace and security, and 13 regional entities, including the EU, who have adopted action plans of their own in relation to the women, peace and security agenda. So now this agenda shaped around 4 pillars, which include participation, and it's something where many countries have stopped. We need to be reminded there are 3 other pillars that we have to bring in the discussion. One is protection. The other one, though, which gets left out often, is prevention. How do we make sure this does not happen? And the 4th pillar, also the least funded one or the often forgotten one, is relief and recovery. So how do we not just include women in the economic processes or the socioeconomic processes related to relief and recovery, but how do we actually rethink relief and recovery and the way it reproduces certain vulnerabilities along gender lines, and not only along gender lines, as you were mentioning, along intersectional lines. So you would probably notice there's a bit of criticism in what I'm saying towards the way WPS has been implemented, because it has ended up in many contexts to what we call adding women and stirring, without challenging the structures within which this function, without challenging the structures that reproduce violence, that make war possible, right? And we'll talk about that more later. So the big question here is, how do we return to the transformative potential of the Women, Peace and Security agenda hand in hand with with the feminist foreign policy? Now, the agenda at the local level has been translated in national action plans, as I said, in all the countries in the Balkans. Some have already adopted a 2nd, a 3rd, and so on, national action plan. But what is interesting is, as conflict affected as our societies here have been, very few, only in Kosovo and Bosnia, do we have national action plans that are inward looking. Even in countries like my own, Macedonia, or North Macedonia, if you will, the national action plans are outward looking. How do we make our peacekeeping missions more gender inclusive or more women inclusive, and so on, without actually reflecting of how women in the Macedonian society, or the society in North Macedonia, have been affected by the conflict in 2001. So then the question becomes, even here, how do we center WPS in a way that takes these lived experiences within our societies seriously? And then related to that, considering that the Balkans is some countries in the Balkans, in particular, are at the barrier of the refugees route, of the route of the people on the move, which is something that is considered in the WPS agenda. What do these countries who have national action plans do about the gendered experiences of refugees in the region? And finally, it would be amiss not to mention the strong anti-gender movement and anti-trans rights movement that all of the countries, I think most of the countries in the region have been affected by. It's a global phenomenon, but we see that in our countries too. And so what is the importance of the WPS and how it becomes actually even more important in the context of this one global push against women's rights and human rights, really, and also regional anti-gender movements. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, no, but that is great for me to continue with questions to then you, Karolina, because I think we can all agree that ideally foreign policy should be a reflection of practices and ideas at home. So if we say we have a feminist foreign policy, it needs to relate, as you said, it needs to be inward-looking. It's not only for the WPS agenda, it's for every foreign policy principle. It needs to reflect our domestic realities. And then my question to you would be, Karolina, to maybe look a little bit more at this domestic context and the domestic preconditions that we would need in this region or in a country that, just let us know which context you're choosing. What is the precondition to have an outward-looking feminist policy at home?
I'm definitely not going to address the Croatian context because we don't have a feminist foreign policy, not even planned yet. To be honest, in our region, Slovenia is the only country that announced and proclaimed that they're going to have a feminist foreign policy. So it would maybe, it would have been really great if we had our Slovenian colleagues here. But I'm definitely going to maybe address the regional context in a way that this is the first time that we have a feminist policy proclaimed in our countries here. And I think it's very important for the, let's say, political, from the political point of view, because especially in my country, but it's the same in every other, I guess, ex-Yugoslav country, we tend to forget our heritage and the emancipatory potential that we already had before the dissolution of Yugoslavia, so we had feminism before, right? It's not like we imported it or we found out about it like in the 90s or after that. We had ties with the global south that in the case of my country, we now don't kind of look at, or we look at it from a perspective that I don't cherish. So what I wanted to say is that when you label a policy or an endeavor, a feminist, when you put a feminist label on it, it's sort of a burden, right, as well, because you have to somehow live up to the expectations. Mm-hmm. It's not enough to label it feminist. You really have to, in our case, maybe think about what it meant, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 60 years ago in Yugoslavia as well, and how to also include this kind of experience and this kind of heritage and this kind of potential into our policies today. So I think when we think about some kind of, let's say, Western Balkans or Southeast European approach to feminist foreign policy, I think it should be different than the approach that Sweden, Germany, or Mexico has. Mm. And I think it should really take into consideration the specificities of societal, economic, political changes that we, and wars, conflicts that we experienced in the 90s. And talking about that, I think we also have to really take into consideration and always have, think about how our sisters, our colleagues from the civil society here in the Western Balkans built their anti-war movement in the 90s, and how that can really inform what our feminist foreign policy from the outskirts of Europe or from the European or EU periphery should look like. Yeah. And we also have to take into consideration that among our countries, some are members of the EU, some are members of NATO, some will never become members of NATO. I hope every country will be part of the European Union sooner or later. So we have a lot of complex issues to also address via this foreign policy. But yes, you're right, and Elena and Serafine both mentioned the challenges that we have on our in our internal kind of forums or our internal contexts, which, to be honest, are not that different from a country to country. It is a strong anti-gender discourse, sponsored by political elites, to be honest. Yeah. So we don't have that many voices, even in mainstream parties where I come from, in political arena, that would stand on firmly on feminist stand, that would address issues from feminist
Which, if I may, very quickly, because we heard both the WPS agenda was very highly influenced in its development by civil society actors, and then FFP in Germany has also both in working towards the coalition treaty, but then also in the development of the guidelines. There has been this really strong element between civil society actors, think tanks, and then political parties. So that is certainly something that you now mention, which then I suppose needs to pay special focus to, is like who are the actors who could be pushing for such a policy, both domestically and then towards foreign policy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's fine. I mean, that's what basically I wanted to highlight, maybe in this first round.
But then, do you see that there would need to be more of a regional cooperation, maybe among actors, or would you say that there needs to be more cooperation with actors from outside the region? Like how?
What I don't see here in this region is cooperation. That's what I lack. Not only in foreign policy, which is maybe for some people controversial to kind of have like a similar approach to foreign policy, but in any other policy for that matter. So I don't see cooperation among not only like-minded political actors, but any political actors for that matter. So yes, I mean, of course, but it has to be initiated by feminist actors in politics, which are not that present. So, yeah, more inclusivity and more diversity, as Serafine said.
Yeah, okay. Well, because we really want to get to some implementation, and we also want to get to this spooky title, Feminist Foreign Policy in Times of War, and how can it work. So let's look at feminist foreign policy in practice. And Elena, maybe we can start by looking at the political economy of feminist foreign policy, because I think that is something that is, in whatever context you look at, a challenge to not see feminist foreign policy as an isolated practice or an isolated policy. And there is this tendency of just regarding feminist foreign policy maybe as an inclusion of more women in diplomatic services or other very narrowing understandings, and maybe a little bit of gender budgeting, but not really looking at economic dynamics, not really looking at trade.
Yeah,
shoot.
Sure.
Let us know.
Sure. And actually, I want to say that, yes, we criticize, but we criticize from a point of love, from a point of we want it to be better. And especially when it comes to feminist foreign policy, the question becomes, how do we avoid that becoming gender washing, right? Label a country, label a policy, feminist foreign policy, and then what do you do with it? Just because you proclaimed it, it doesn't mean that it is actually feminist in practice or in the implementation. And one important aspect of feminist foreign policy, I mean, why it's such a burden almost to label it as such, is that it has to fundamentally consider how the domestic level connects with the global. You cannot have a feminist foreign policy and a patriarchal domestic policy, which many countries do. But on the global level, I think it's important to think of how is it possible to have a feminist foreign policy in the context of hyper-capitalism? And what I mean by this is that we know that within hyper-capitalism, within this hierarchical structure, or structure that even reproduces further hierarchies, there are exploitative practices and forms of work within the home. And if any feminist would tell you that we have to consider how the public and the private are blurred, right? So we cannot just keep expecting women to pick up the slack at home, within the system. So how does that connect to there being a feminist foreign policy? How is it possible to have a feminist foreign policy in the context of export processing zones, which are heavily gendered, and then the gendered lines of work within the global value chains, right? Where work and processes or production processes are exported to the global south at very low wages, with very little protection of workers' rights and human rights, but at the same time, these businesses do come, or the capital does come, from countries that might have declared to have feminist foreign policy. So how do we consider these holistically is the big question here. The feminist foreign policy cannot be just one thing. It has to be related to development aid, and development aid has to be feminist at its heart, but also trade and political economy more broadly has to be feminist in its essence as well. And this then I link also to processes of resource extraction, and it's something that's happening in the Balkans as well, but not only. So feminist foreign policy, or any foreign policy really, cannot call itself feminist, let alone inclusive, if it doesn't consider how practices contribute to the climate crisis. Because we know who is the most heavily affected by the climate crisis. Research shows us that this is women and its marginalized bodies and marginalized peoples and communities in the global south, not only, but in the global south. So then, if a country heavily contributes to the climate crisis and to the escalation of the climate crisis, does that bode well with there being a feminist foreign policy? And these things really have to be taken into consideration together. And again, this stresses really, places the emphasis of intersectionality. Women are not a monolith. And therefore, in any policy, including in foreign policy, we have to consider that the different types of experiences, different types of needs, and different priorities that those entail. And finally, I think feminist foreign policy, and this is something that's been highlighted since Sweden declared feminist foreign policy, we have to ask the question of whether it's possible to have feminist anything in a context of militarized world, in the context of a world where countries contribute heavily to the arms trade, where they trade arms with countries who violate human rights and women's rights, but also countries who inflict violence on others. I don't want to mention the elephant in the room now because I'll mention it later, but within the current context, how many of the countries who have declared a feminist foreign policy have spoken a word on what's happening in Gaza? So in some ways, actually, to pick up on what Karolina was saying, perhaps we need to move closer to some of the principles of the non-aligned movement, which had a holistic understanding of peace, had an understanding of peace that connected the political and the economic and connected the anti-militarization of the world. For all its deficiencies, though, we perhaps need a feminist non-aligned movement, which would take some of the lessons learned from the non-aligned movement, but go a step further in many ways, turning or combining the global and the domestic. I'll stop here. So there's
and I feel like this is exactly the point where maybe some people are starting to be lost. I mean, not in this room, but in general, when you speak out about militarization and that we would need less militarization, because then I would say, well, we are at war. How can we not militarize? How can we not defend ourselves? So, Serafine, since you have also been working extensively on the national security strategy in Germany and also other security strategies, I would like to bring that question to you before we go into audience questions, to how to understand how feminist foreign policy can actually provide security in such times. And then, because we heard about it before, we heard about the WPS pillars, one of the pillars being prevention, which of course leads us to a long-term strategy. So then maybe tell us more about the difference between a long-term strategy for security and feminist foreign policy and short-term reactions.
Yeah, I will try to do all that.
I know, it's all really big topics, and I feel like we're just at the beginning of starting this conversation in this context. So.
But maybe I would just like to tie back to some things that Elena and Karolina said, especially about this, I think it was you, Karolina, who called it the burden of labeling that declaring a feminist foreign policy brings with it. And this is very much the point that I've been trying to make, is that actually, like, this is not something completely new. And last year, there were all these questions also in Germany. Okay, we're doing a feminist foreign policy, but what does it mean? What do we do now? But actually, like, it's just a reflection and a correction of the implementation of agendas that have already been done, including the Women, Peace and Security agenda, including all the conversations that have been taking place about human security since the 1990s, and this realization that actually security must be about the fulfillment of human needs and not just about like state-to-state security, and that doesn't work anymore, and it probably has never worked. So I just wanted to emphasize this actually corrective potential that feminist foreign policy has, and this way of holding governments more accountable, and then tying back to strategic processes. So I found interesting working on and around some of also like EU-related strategies on how do we do strategic autonomy and all of these things. What is often missing is these mechanisms of actually like holding the strategy accountable and checking whether there's actually like monitoring of the implementation of strategies. And also what I find quite interesting also about the guidelines now is that for a government document, the tone is quite transformative, and I think this is really interesting because it's really rare that you get such a self-critical approach in government documents, and not just statements of intent, but also saying. And I think that is also a very important element now, is that one of the efforts that is being led is really a reconsideration of all of the working structures internally of the Federal Foreign Office. So 4 out of the 10 guidelines formulated by the office are actually about its inward working structure, which I think is important. On the other hand, there is this limitation. We have guidelines from the Federal Foreign Office on foreign policy, and we have guidelines from the Development Ministry on feminist development policy, but we don't have an overarching government feminist foreign policy. And this creates kind of a tension if you compare the language of the national security strategy with the language of these feminist guidelines. The tone in the security strategy is much more, well, that of a typical strategy, right? And it does address some of the more contemporary insights about how security is not a monolith either, but how it's about an interaction between society and the economy and individuals. But it kind of lacks a little bit this feminist reflex that the foreign policy guidelines try to implement. So there is this tension, but again, I think it's this like analytical and corrective potential that makes the new term interesting as a, if you will, like a standard of holding accountable. And perhaps just to put some numbers on that, so the guidelines commit by 2025 to invest 85% of aid into gender-sensitive projects, so which have gender equality as their secondary goal, and then 8% of aid into gender-transformative projects that have gender equality as their primary goal. So this is also quite interesting in trying to attempt to remedy some of the mainstreaming approaches that maybe didn't work as well in the past. But you asked me to speak about human security and about maybe
yeah,
the
maybe
debates
very
on
quickly,
security.
because I think it would be important to make this difference between what is a traditional approach to security and why is a feminist approach unique in its way, and how could that transformative potential unfold?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps let me tie back a little bit into some of the debates we've been having last year, because and still sometimes there is a lack of clarity on what is it supposed to mean in practice, and you mentioned this tendency now for militarization that is in tension with also the need to invest in certain security decisions in the short term. So I think here we have something with which we can try to bridge the tensions that there are between what is happening in reality and what is the ambition of feminist foreign policies, by saying, okay, in the short term, we need to be able to react, and the focus of a reaction needs to be the protection of civilian population and taking into account the fact that civilian population is differently affected in different ways, and how can we remedy that? And then in the long term, to see how, and you mentioned the 3 pillars of WPS, how can we reflect that in reconstruction efforts? How can we reflect that also in terms of post-fact protection of rights, so in establishing justice for example, crimes that have been done, and trying to do some work in the long term to transform the understanding of security. And again, I don't think that this is something that is completely new. I think this is an understanding that has been in state practice, at least emerging in the past 30 years, and in civil society, been around for at least 100 years with the feminist movement of the turn of the century. So I think also getting people to talk about it, and getting foreign and security policy people to talk about feminist foreign policy, and forcing officials to defend feminist foreign policy, I think that also has the potential to create some mindset change, which is notoriously difficult to achieve in any strategic processes.
I mean, that was a great bridge to bring in the audience and involve people. Are there any questions? Yes, please. The microphone is right behind you.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anna Kuchenbecker from ECFR. I have a question. So I see feminist foreign policy really as part of the value-based foreign policy. When we look around us, given the world where we see the rise of China, an aggressive Russia, Iran, so where the space is really shrinking for a values-based foreign policy to be pushed through to take effect. And I think the best example is the revolution in Iran, that is a women-led movement. And when we look at the reactions, for example, at Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, so that was rather subdued. And of course, it was because of the JPCOA. And I'm wondering, how do we deal with this in a world where the space of value-based foreign policy is shrinking, when in a case that is so obvious, a case for feminist foreign policy, when we are not able to really act on that?
Is there any other question at this? Yeah, please. Here and then.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the panel topic. I have one comment and one question. I want to contribute to what Serafine mentioned on how important it is to introduce this topic from our experience in BCSP dealing with women, peace and security in security governance. It was actually the one topic that will show all the informal dynamics of security governance. So you wouldn't find only about the issues of representation of women and men, but you will find where the power is in institutions, who security is for, who is informally making decisions, what are corrupt practices and so on. So I think these lenses are very important to keep on in discussing the issues that the forum brings forward. But the question I want to ask is, can we promote feminist policy, not just foreign, but domestic also, in an inclusive way which does not deepen the divisions further? Because I've really seen it all over again, even at the micro level of civil society, that some of my close friends that I really have high opinion of, feminist activists, are turning off communication when somebody uses non-politically correct language, when somebody speaks about patriotism in traditional way. And these patriots are at the same time the leading environmental activists in a province of Serbia. So I would really be keen to hear for examples. And also from our politician on a panel, how do you do it in practice, bringing together the different groups in Croatian society, which is also quite divided? And I'm aware of a good example from advocacy for ratification of Istanbul Convention in Croatia, where theologists were brought to advocate together with human rights activists on why this is actually a good Christian practice and not just a human rights issue. But can you do it in the work of Social Democratic Party in practice?
Thank you.
So I don't want to abuse the position of a host to ask questions, but I really like the debate, so I want to ask one to Serafine. So in the last couple of years, we see Germany really at the forefront of feminist foreign policy, and because Sonia as well was talking about, in practice, so what are, for example, the practical implications of it when it comes to war in Ukraine, for example? What worked, what didn't work?
Okay. Yes, maybe one more question and then we give it to the panel.
Thanks very much. Karen Landgren from Security Council Report. There's a document out now from the Secretary General called the New Agenda for Peace, and it's leading towards a summit of the future next September and a pact of the future. And I mention this because it contains very strong language about misogyny and the growth of misogyny in conflict situations and in situations with weak institutions. It also includes a call for dismantling the patriarchy, which I don't think I've ever heard from the Secretary General's lips before, so that's quite interesting. Now, in practice, I don't see the UN really knowing how even to apply that to the situation of Afghanistan in terms of a coherent policy. But I think it's going to be a big challenge to retain strong gender language in the Pact of the Future that is supposed to emerge by next September. So I want to suggest that as a kind of goalpost that might unite groups that support a feminist foreign policy and women's groups generally to work towards this, because if it is lost, and I just sense that's the way things are going in international relations these days and at the UN, that will be a big loss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there were a lot of very interesting points, so thank you for contributing. And I think what has become quite obvious is what was also mentioned yesterday in a different setting, is that there is this sense of urgency to do something, and that sometimes I feel that people expect or have very high hopes for feminist foreign policy and for the transformative potential right now, but then that then cannot quite be met with the reality of political practice. And that also relates a little bit to what the last question addressed, is that there seems to be quite a momentum right now, but how to use it and how not to lose it to growing patriarchal tendencies, to what you mentioned before, the anti-feminist movement, anti-gender movement. And yeah, maybe a good starting point is to really look at practical implementations right now. So maybe, Serafine, if you would want to start and respond to that.
Perhaps some of the colleagues want to start because I was.
Oh yeah, maybe also.
I want to.
Yeah,
I mean,
Elena.
so there was a question about value-based foreign policy, which I appreciate. I mean, I appreciate all the comments and questions, but that one, I find it very interesting because I think all foreign policy is value-based. They're not all progressive values. I think Russian foreign policy is value-based as well. We might disagree with the values that are at the heart of it. But I think the question is, how can the champions, and even those who do not call themselves, do not call their foreign policy feminist, how can those who stand for progressive values actually defend them and advance them? And I think the moment is poignant because there is a chance to do that every day. How do we center human security in foreign policy where it becomes paramount or truthism that human lives matter without, for instance, asking whether they're Israeli lives or Palestinian lives? They both should matter, right? So I think actually the space is shrinking, maybe at the UN Security Council level, certainly, but I think the space and the opportunities for feminists, for acting in foreign policy in a feminist way, they're there are many opportunities to do that at any given moment in time. For instance, Ukrainian women refugees going to Poland and having no right to reproductive health care is a place to start. Again, proclaiming that genocide is wrong is an easy place to start as well. Maybe one we all would agree on. So I think the space at some level, sure, globally is shrinking, but the opportunities are ever more. And I think we and by we I mean both civil society and political leaders, need to make sure that that practice is there. And again, for countries that have experienced violence and countries who proclaim to be feminist foreign policy champions. And to Sonja's point, briefly, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I see this in Macedonia, like the lack of solidarities across movements. And I think what we all, and it's hard to do this when you've been at it for decades and you're just burnt out. But I think we all need to, feminists, environmentalists, all alike, to be a little more open and approach things with humility, that maybe we don't have all the correct answers. And that maybe there is still potential to learn from one another. I think Chile is a good example. I'm not going to go into the details here, but Chile actually is a good example of a country that has proclaimed feminist foreign policy, but also is really feminist and inclusive in nature in what they do internally as well. They've brought on environmental activists, indigenous activists, feminist activists, and so on. So Chile would be an example of how potentially we could move forward.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you want to pick up
yes,
right there.
Yes, I want to pick up on Sonja's question, actually, and comment. I think we are in politics and in civil society, but I'm going to talk about politics, really kind of focused on sort of purity, in ideological terms. And we think we are, of course we are not, but we think we are like those that really are the only ones that have the kind of the power to call ourselves like progressives, social democrats, whatever, although, you know, many people don't see us in that way. So it's that was a very good example of the ratification of Istanbul Convention, but it would have never happened if the ruling party, which is the EPP member party, was not supportive of it. So we wouldn't be able to ratify it in the parliament. I'm saying that we should, when we talk about gender equality or when we talk about feminist foreign policy, we should make it I wouldn't say all-party, but a cross-party issue, or even not a party issue at all. We should make it a societal kind of question so that we can bring more people in, because we do live in heavily polarized societies here. And some civil society organizations that are real feminists don't want to have anything to do with my party because we are considered to be a center-left mainstream party, and we have a burden of having been in government. We didn't perform as we were expected to. So you know all the consequences of that, or maybe some people don't, but still I feel it, because it's always women that then have to reach out to our sisters from the civil society and try to rebuild bridges, which is not always possible. But I think what we see in Croatia is a transformation of political space, not that much of civil society space, or at least not the established civil society space, but yes, there are some new movements that then political parties should really take into consideration. And the problem is that political parties don't take new movements and new kind of narratives into consideration, but you're totally right. It's, we need to compromise, and I don't think we are used to that in our region. That's for sure. So I cannot really say that we are successful in what you're suggesting, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. So we need to do much more and much different. But the case of feminist foreign policy, or the proclamation of it in Slovenia, really has to do also with, like, oh, we are a small country, we can do anything. So it's something that, these big players like Germany, Sweden, Canada, it's for them, it's not for us. So we cannot change anything. We just go along the EU foreign and security policy lines. That's not true. I think we can contribute and we should be more ambitious in that.
As the example of Slovenia
Yeah,
shows, for
right.
example, that it is possible. So maybe for you to answer to.
Yeah, perhaps linking to the debate on polarization and to Sonia's question, I mean, I don't think you have to look as far as this region to have polarization about feminism. And as I was mentioning before, like it was not consensual in Germany either to introduce these guidelines now, which is also reflected by the fact that they're issued only by the Foreign Ministry and Development Ministry, right? And also perhaps interesting that in the coalition treaty, actually, it was quite contested to include this notion of feminist foreign policy. So we have this coalition between the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the Liberals, and this was obviously an initiative that was driven by the Greens to an extent, and then the consensus in the treaty was actually to use the term feminist foreign policy in English rather than in German to make it less contentious and to make it more unclear what it was about, so people could agree on it. So I think that speaks volumes. But then also in the wake of the invasion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the foreign minister was also challenged on this and on the question like, why do we need to? I mean, you can do your feminist foreign policy, but like don't do it on our military budget. And that was actually like a quite powerful rebuke that was given then by the foreign minister who had just returned from Bosnia, who had just spoken to survivors of Srebrenica, and who was saying that, you know, the consequence of these episodes of suffering against the civilian population is that we need to have a more transformative ambition for feminist foreign policy in the 21st century. Perhaps to return to the question on value-based foreign policy and the question of Iran. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a fair standard to ask feminist foreign policy to resolve all the issues that value-based foreign policy in general is facing, right? And I think in this situation as well, like any foreign policy struggles to influence what is happening internally in Iran, and there's very little leverage over what is happening domestically. So I'm not sure what a better response should have been. I mean, the foreign minister did lead within the UN efforts to set up monitoring on human rights abuses, but ultimately, I'm not sure what the levers on what is going on domestically in this situation are. And at the same time, I'm not sure that the fact that values and value-based policy in general is facing difficulty and backlash within the international system at the moment, I don't think that means that we can say, okay, it's not working, and we might as well drop it. And on some of the practical implications, my personal impression is that there was a little bit of a panic moment last year in response to Ukraine on what do we do now, and that is before there were the guidelines and before there was a concrete consensus on what could be done. There have been efforts to in particular into investigations of war crimes and collecting evidence and collaborating with prosecutors in Ukraine and in Germany to kind of prosecute war crimes that are related to sexual violence, and supplying so-called rape kits in Ukraine to help the investigations on this. But to be honest, I find it hard to find a comprehensive list of gender-responsive efforts that have been led by the government on Ukraine. If there are colleagues from the Foreign Office present that know more about this than I do, then I would be really interested. But I have asked these questions to some, and this was more or less the answer that I got. And perhaps to conclude, just my answers to this, I mean, I think there is always the challenge of having a government-led policy that has the ambition to transform the order in which it is being established. So there's always this inherent contradiction. So you might argue that a government can't pursue this type of policy because it's operating within a global order or a disorder that we're talking about, that it ultimately wants to challenge. So this will always be a tension when a government is trying to do that. But I do think it's an interesting strategy of going towards more change.
Yeah, I mean, this already goes into the direction of closing remarks, where, I mean, we're almost at the end. And I think it has become very obvious that feminist foreign policy isn't a magic trick where you can pull it out of your pocket and be like, bam, here, I have all the solutions, but that it's rather challenging us to find a different approach to all of the poly crises that are going on, that it's helping us to break this cycle of crisis thinking by trying to look more into the future, by developing long-term strategies. But it has also become, in a lot of your remarks, obvious that incremental change, that small change is also something that can already be implemented at this point from a feminist perspective. So maybe to wrap things up in the last 3 minutes, if each of you could dare a look into the future and say, from your perspective, you can be utopian about it, you can be very realistic about it, whatever floats your boat, to let us know, let us leave on a constructive note. What's the next step? What can we now do? What context? How can we advance feminist foreign policy for this region? Elena, you start.
I started on the previous one. Someone else wants to start on this one?
I think the easiest answer from my side would be to win elections, both nationally and on the European Union level. But yes, I mean, just picking up where Serafine just stopped, I think we should kind of, be more involved in public business or in politics. So that these governments should, they look different in future than they look today, okay? Not only having more women, but having more feminists of all sorts in those governments. So that would be the easiest way, but it's the hardest way also. But I would never stop believing in the power of collective endeavor. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you.
I think one conclusion we can draw is that we need to keep asking, but we also need to keep explaining. So I think one positive result of the public debates we've been having in Germany and in the EU in the past year and a half has been that there has been much more debate within civil society about security policy. And that was not a topic that was so widely discussed before that. And I do think there are opportunities there in trying to forge a more participatory approach and an approach that people feel more represented by internationally. And to keep asking is to keep asking the question, okay, what are you doing right now? And we can help formulating some suggestions for that, but we need to keep asking questions.
Yes, picking up on what both of you nicely said, I think it's also taking stock of the victories, as small as they might be, of the successes, as small as they might be, is the only way to fuel oneself, and not just oneself, collectively as well, in pushing forward. Second, understand that feminist foreign policy is not just about women. It's never been just about women. Third, learn from one another. At civil society level, at the policy level as well. Fourth, ensure funding, because if the anti-gender movement is so well funded, there's nothing, really no excuses for the movement that advances human rights to be less funded than that. Fifth, challenge power relations, that's the dreaming part. And then sixth, I guess, is ensure that feminist foreign policy does not become another tool of perpetuating the imperialist and militaristic status quo and be used as a weapon for imperialist intervention, as it was really the case in Afghanistan in 2001. Women's rights were used in that direction. So make sure that feminist foreign policy is holistic in nature. And then seventh, I guess, is to use foreign policy as a way, as a mirror to the society, and understanding to understand what's happening domestically and how the two relate. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you so much. It was a very dense panel, and I think it has become very obvious that we need more discussions on this. We need to ask more questions. We need to continue with explanations. We need to continue learning, going into this exchange. And I'm very happy that we had this opportunity here today. I hope it won't be the last. And thank you very much.
Well done.